Thank you very much. So it's my great pleasure to be here and to welcome all of you here. This is the first of our events and we hope one of many. So, facilitating reuse of public information while minimizing negative consequences is a very long title for my little bit. But that's really what I think we're trying to get at in opening up data. So, as our MC pointed out, there are 2 Law Reform Commission consultations taking place at the moment, one on government records, one on access to information. It is natural that this is a stimulation for discussion on access to information generally. Indeed, one can assume that we will come to the conclusion that all useful government information should be archived and should be made accessible unless there is a good reason not to make it accessible. So you're going to hear a little bit more from Stacey later on about it from an archivist perspective. So many people in Hong Kong, including civil servants in many cases, as well as academics, want better access to government data, whether it's for commercial, social, or academic purposes. So how can we achieve this? But of course, it's essential that making that data accessible does not infringe on the data protection law or privacy rights, or indeed on the census ordinance. So we need to address those things. So the government's role is crucial. First of all, because they own or collect so much data. Secondly, because they fund a lot of data through contracts and research grants. And thirdly, they also control a lot of other data indirectly through licensing. So for example, the public transport system, where although it's private companies, they are licensed by the government. So, if we look at how well Hong Kong is doing on open data, if you look at our ranking, we don't look too good. Now, I should point out that this index is somewhat out of date. It's at least 2 years out of date. So we have colleagues here from the data.gov portal. So I'm sure with all their hard work, Hong Kong's ranking is going to improve from its previous version of level of 24. Interestingly, Taiwan is number 1 in terms of this. So what are the key criteria that they used in determining how jurisdictions perform? Is the data openly licensed? Is all legal use allowed? This is one area where Hong Kong was a long way behind, but is now quite good. Secondly, is it machine readable? The best is something like XML, the worst is images. Thirdly, is it downloadable? You don't need to visit a government office to access it. Fourthly, is it kept up to date if the data changes? Fifthly, is it publicly available for everyone, not just for people who've paid money or have good relationships? And lastly, is it free of charge? So if you look at Hong Kong's strengths and weaknesses, our weaknesses are on administrative boundaries, our company registry data, locational data, meaning geographical data, government spending, and land ownership. At the time this was done, they all got a 0 score because they either are not open or they're not free of charge or some of the other criteria. So what are the things we can do? So OGCIO has already done quite a lot, implementing best practices to make the data available, converting the administrative boundaries into data sets that meet open data standards. That's something which Hong Kong could do a lot more. We are promised that much more is going to be done. We need to wait and see. And lastly, to change admin practices. So there are some very important data sets which currently are being sold. So the land registry data on building and land ownership, the company registry data, and the lands department data. So again, we know that there are moves to change some of these, but clearly this requires a bit more change because it's not just a matter of giving it away, but how do you address the existing commercial relationships? So the broader Hong Kong context is arguably that data sharing and reuse is good in principle because it enables better policy decisions and better decisions about individuals. The major constraints are privacy, ownership, and security. Now we of course also need to be well aware that the mainland is very different to us. They have a very different trade-off between personal data about public good and private good. You just need to look at the social credit system to see that. So, in the past, the Hong Kong government's attitude was very conservative. Their standard response was that there are risks of sharing information, so don't share it unless there's a precedent, even if it's not personal data. So my classic example was I wanted police data on crimes at the district level, and I was told it was impossible, even though I know that data exists. So we have no records law, we have no freedom of information law, we do have a code of access, but it is extremely weak. Just to give you 3 examples, those exemptions include disclosure would harm or prejudice competitive or financial position or the property interests of the government. Well, that can be used to exempt almost anything if you choose to use it that way. Secondly, information could only be made available by unreasonable diversion of a department's resources. Well, you can make almost anything sound unreasonable if it suits you. And then lastly, that disclosure could be misleading. Obviously, that one is a serious one. Or deprive the department or any other person of priority of publication or commercial value. In other words, if we've sold it to anyone else, we can't give it to you. So, census data. So, in Hong Kong, census data, the questionnaires are destroyed after the data has been transferred. That is unlike many other places where the census data is locked away for maybe a century and then released. So this has historical consequences. We cannot go back and ask questions about the census that was done a century ago in Hong Kong, unlike in other places. However, in Hong Kong, the census tables have been available for free for quite a long time, and they also allow secure access to data sets via the enclave, at least for academic purposes. So this is a problem if you're a historian, not such a problem if you're a statistician. What about public registers? Well, the data protection law says about access and correction prior to proposed adverse administrative or private decisions and matching approval only if the competing social need overrides the privacy interest. So there is a use limitation exemption in the law, but this is often not explicit. What is the purpose? So the judiciary data, for example, they put up on their website, there is no purpose stated. So what is or is not used? And that has caused problems with startups who tried to use that judiciary data and got into trouble with the Privacy Commissioner. So what about health records? So Hong Kong is a very special case because our public hospitals are nearly free. So they're very widely used and they have a very complete electronic record system. But that also covers the public health clinics, including the sexual hygiene clinics. And unfortunately, the e-health record law, which the government is very proud of, says that you either opt in for all or nothing. So you cannot choose to exclude some of your medical records. You either make them all accessible or none of them accessible. So big data enthusiasts want access to the data for good reason. But there is a problem that they assume anonymity solves the problem. But the problem is you can re-identify people from the data sets. So there are problems in these situations. So what about research data access? So if you look overseas, most universities are required to make public research data publicly available after a suitable period of time and subject to privacy constraints. We do not have that in Hong Kong. So Hong Kong EU does now require archiving of all research data for new research projects, but the reason is for integrity, not for sharing. So although it enables sharing, it is not required. We also have a problem that some academics are very naive. For example, they assume that DNA data after anonymization can be freely shared. But clearly you can re-identify people from DNA data. So what's our conclusions? So access to data which was personal data, even after anonymization, requires very careful assessment of the risk of re-identification, as the consequences are often irreversible. Secondly, money is rarely a good reason to restrict access to government data because the full benefits far outweigh this relatively small income the government is getting and the costs have already been paid. But this requires willingness to change procedures. Thirdly, the Law Reform Commission consultations are an opportunity for us to revisit these old policies and to increase access and reuse of government data, whether it's fully open or necessarily restricted. Lastly, we may need to re-examine commercial use. As I said, census allows academic use of their data. They are very restrictive as far as commercial use is concerned. So commercial use may lead to great public value, So, and we need to be careful. The Facebook scandal shows that academic access is not always safer. This is a link to some additional information. I hope you find it helpful. Thank you very much.